Welcome back to Raised by Giants, where we talk all things spirituality. I'm Ryder Lee. Tonight we have retired Army Intelligence Officer, Desert Storm veteran, and 7-year alumnus of the Department of Defense Stargate Remote Viewing Psychic Spy Program, Dr. Paul H. Smith, speaking about the Stargate Remote Viewing Unit at Fort Meade and much more. But before I introduce him, check out Raised by Giants on Rokfin. It is a completely uncensored platform. Go over there, set up a free account, get all of my regular content I post here on YouTube, and sign up for Rokfin's premium content, which is far less than a YouTube premium account, at only $10 a month. And you'll get all of my premium uncensored content when it gets released, and all of the other creators' premium content as well, like Beyond Classified, Charlie Robinson, Jay Dyer, Zero with Sam Tripoli, Tinfoil Hat, Eddie Bravo, and Rex Bear Leak Project, and much more. Check the link in the description to sign up for the video streaming platform, Rokfin. Also, check out C60 Purple Power. It is the most powerful antioxidant on the planet. Helps with energy levels, skin problems, infections, eyesight, brain cognition, EMF radiation, and a lot more. It's a free radical sponge that gives your body the ability to heal itself. And if you use promo code GIANTS10 from the link in the description, you'll get 10% off your entire purchase. I highly recommend it. I've been using it for over a year with my own money, and I wouldn't recommend something that doesn't work. Dr. Paul H. Smith, thank you so much for coming on my show. I've been trying to get a hold of you for a while now, and I'm glad that you finally made it and we can finally do this. How are you doing, my friend?
Good. So that was all a test to see if you really were serious about wanting me on, and you passed the test. So here I am.
Awesome. Thank you. And I've been doing a lot of investigative work into the Stargate project. I've been trying to interview as many people that's legitimately been involved, because I think that it's something that a lot of people need to wrap their head around and realize that the government was actually studying remote viewing and psychics and ESP research. So to start this out, let's get a little background on you and how you got initially involved and what year you were brought into the Stargate project.
Well, it was 1983. I had spent 3 years over in Germany with a special forces unit. I was their intelligence officer and strategic intelligence officer, which was quite a trip. Let me tell you, it was pretty fun and fascinating. Come back and done an Army school in Arizona, and then I got assigned to be a Mideast desk officer, essentially a analyst for Middle Eastern issues at Fort Meade, Maryland, which is between Baltimore and DC. So that was the spring, and unbeknownst to me, I had moved in. They'd assigned me military quarters right next door to Skip Atwater. We knew him then as Captain Fred Atwater, who is the operations and training officer, and actually informally the founder of the Army branch of the program. And across the street from Tom McNair, who was at that time the one remaining remote viewing trainee, almost a full-blown remote viewer. I had never put the two words remote and viewing together. I had no idea any of this existed. But what I wasn't aware of is as Skip and Tom were kind of observing me, because they had a contract to train some more Army personnel with SRI, formerly Stanford Research Institute, and they needed some more people because they didn't have enough identified. So they were kind of monitoring their entire circle of acquaintances to see who might be a good subject for this. And the criteria they were looking for is always comes up. Why did they pick you, right? The criteria they're looking for is an Army officer who was competent in his profession, his or her profession. So got good report cards, all that kind of thing. But then had additional talents, abilities, whatever you want. So, but in kind of what we would call right brain pursuits such as studio art, they painted or drew or whatever, music, performance, creative writing, and languages, which is not all that unusual. The other things are somewhat unusual in the military, but languages wasn't unusual in the intelligence world. But then they got to know me, and they realized I had majored in art for a while when I was at Brigham Young University, illustrated scientific papers and textbooks, had been playing guitar by then for about 20 years. I like to write short stories and send them off and get rejected. And I was fluent in German and was at that time competent in Arabic and Hebrew. And so they kind of thought, well, we can't not try this guy out. See, all this is happening offline. I had no idea that this was going on. And then one day, Skip and Tom come together. I was at lunch, I think, and we were all home for lunch. And they came over to my house and knocked on the door and said, we think you might be good at what we do. I said, well, what do you do? And they said, well, we can't tell you. And I said, well, how do I know if I'm going to be good? And they said, well, we're going to give you some tests and stuff, and then we'll give you a try. Okay. Well, all right. I mean, I found my job at the time kind of boring. It was more of a bookkeeping job than anything. And so they gave me the test. There's kind of mostly standard psychology tests and such things as that, and personality profile tests and such. And I seemed to score where they wanted to. So they invited me over to their offices and read me on, and gave me the opportunity to volunteer for it. So there I was.
So from my understanding, this kind of started with the CIA funding SRI International. And when SRI split from Stanford University in, I believe, 1970, they became known as SRI International, and I think 1973. And then it became funded by the CIA. And then later on, I'm not too sure at what point the Army intelligence got involved and created this project, but was the Army intelligence a special access program, and then whenever it got transferred to the DIA, then it became another special access program, or was it not a special access program in the Army?
Let me give the history of this. It's very confusing because there's really two different tangents to this. There's the SRI, ultimately moved to SAIC in the 90s. There's that research branch, which did some operational work. Then there was the military side of it, which really got off the ground with the Air Force in 1975. And that was a kind of a different branch. Of course, they all, they cross-pollinated all the time. But they were part of the same program, but they were kind of divergent channels. So, well, not divergent either. That's kind of the wrong thing to say too. But at any rate, so the research part was never anything but collateral intelligence. It means there's no compartmentation, there's no special access kind of a thing in terms of what they were doing at SRI. Okay. The military side of it started off as just a small, relatively informal, but still budgeted program with the Air Force. In 1979, the Air Force terminated their involvement with remote viewing and with the funding of SRI. And at that point, the behind the scenes actor was the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is a military intelligence organization. They had been working with the Air Force. When the Air Force got out of it, by that time, there's a little bit of overlap. The Army started a program in 1977, very small, in-house, budgeted from the Army Intelligence Security Command, not from Congress. And then DIA started working with the Army more closely when the Air Force left. And at about that point is when they started introducing SAP, okay, the Special Access Program caveat for this unit. And which Special Access Program means that only, even if you have a security clearance of the correct level, doesn't mean you get to know about this program. Okay, only a very limited number of people are allowed access to a Special Access Program. They have to have a very explicit need to know. The main reason for that wasn't that we were using parapsychology, remote viewing, anything like that. The main reason was protect us, the sources. Because as far as anybody knew then, and it's still true, there is no way to shield against remote viewing. It seems to be able to get through any shielding you have. It doesn't matter. But the way to stop it is to take out the people doing it, right? And so if the Russians got wind we had a program and it was successful, the worry was they would recognize that the only way to stop it would be to assassinate, essentially, or disable in some way the remote viewers. And so it was the special access program. I mean, there are other reasons, but this was the main one, was meant to protect the remote viewers.
What was the name of this project when you first got into it? Because from my understanding, it went by a bunch of different names, a bunch of different code names. So what was the name of the project when you got into it?
So first, people don't understand this whole code name business. Projects have code names so you can talk about them in the open, in public, without anybody knowing what you're talking about, right? So that's useful for budgeting in Congress and things like that. It started off very briefly as Gondola Wish when they first started the Army program. There was a bigger overall umbrella term, which was Grill Flame. But the Army program started off as Gondola Wish. Then it became Grill Flame because it got united with, affiliated with DIA, which was using that name. And then when I came on board, it was just when it's changing from Grill Flame to Center Lane. Now there's two reasons to change, three reasons maybe. Well, I'll hit two. One is if you change funding sources and you change programmatic envelopes, right? So it went from Grill Flame to Center Lane because the funder changed. Let me see if this is right. Yes, we got congressional support at that point. So the funding changed, and to some degree, the hierarchy, the organizational chart changed. And so they changed the program name. The other time you change it is every 5 years. It's required that you change a program name just for security reasons. If the enemy starts figuring out, okay, well, when they say Grill Flame, they're talking about this. Oh, we think we know what's going on. And poof, then Grill Flame goes away. They haven't figured out Center Lane has anything to do with that yet, right? So that's the two reasons. So it changed the Center Lane just as I was coming on board.
You know how it got to be named the Stargate project? Like,
Yeah.
do you know who was responsible for changing it or making it the Stargate project?
Yeah. So first off, the way you pick these names is you're not supposed to have anybody come up and say, well, I like the sound of these two words, right? They're supposed to be two words separate. So what they do is they do two separately generated computer lists, and you had to pick the first name off one list and the second part of the name off the second list. That's how we got Grill Flame. That's how we got Center Lane. The next iteration happened in 1986. Is called Sunstreak. Okay. And then 5 years later, it was time to change from Sunstreak to something else. And that's when Stargate started to be used. And this is how that worked. They generated the two lists. And Dale Graff, who is Dale is somebody who doesn't get a lot of credit out there, but he was probably, other than the people who developed remote viewing in the first place, he was probably one of the key people over the time of the program. Very important guy. Dale was the one that saved the program in 1975 when the CIA bailed out and the Air Force took over. He was the one that he was an Air Force intelligence analyst at the time. He was the one that talked the Air Force into funding SRI for 4 years, right? He ended up getting fired because the chief of staff of the Air Force didn't like remote viewing. And so he told Dale, we're canceling the RV program and you're leaving, essentially. And so Dale ended up working for DIA. Well, up in 1990, he came out of DIA as a staff officer and became the commander, if you will, the leader of the remote viewing unit at Fort Meade. And so he had to change the name. And he gets two computer lists, and one of them had Star on it. He said, I like the sound of Star, but the other list just had stupid names. He didn't like any of them. And so one day he's driving down the road and he was passing, and he saw that, he lived out in rural Maryland. So he was driving home and he just happened to notice this interesting looking gate off to the side. And he said, "Gal, that's a gate, gate. Stargate. Hey, that sounds pretty good." And so he lobbied to get them to accept Gate, even though it wasn't on their list. And so it became Stargate, 2 words, each one capitalized. And that was, of course, long before the TV series or the movie came out. I don't know how long. It was at least a few years before the movie came out. And so we the remote viewing program have title rights to that name. So.
That's really interesting because I've had Dale on my show, and he knows what he's talking about, and I'm glad you mentioned him because now, whenever I was interviewing him, he mentioned that the funding stopped from the CIA at a point, and then it was never reinitiated. But from my information and the research that I've done, it looks like there was a period of the time where the CIA was funding SRI International, and there was like a time period that lapsed. And I think that this revolves somewhere around the time period that Pat Price got split from SRI and started to be working with them individually, like on an individual basis. And that's when they stopped the funding. But then, according to Russell Targ and what Russell Targ has talked about, I know Russell wasn't really involved in the Stargate project, that he was involved with SRI, right? But he states that the funding did pick back up after Pat Price had died, and him and Hal Puthoff received more funding from the CIA to continue their work.
So the way that worked, they did the experiment, and it was Hal Puthoff and Ingo Swann, the one who actually came up with remote viewing in the first place, the innovator of remote viewing is probably a good way to say it. Ingo Swann and Hal Puthoff did an experiment on June 6, 1972. Yeah, June 6, 1972, which got the CIA's attention. They were looking for somebody to research and look into parapsychology things because the Soviets were doing it and spending literally hundreds of millions of dollar equivalents on this program. You know, we get yelled at because we spent 20 to 25 million over 23 years, right? The Russians were doing it, spending hundreds of millions of dollars over maybe a decade up to that time. So the CIA didn't necessarily believe in the phenomenon, but they were concerned. The Russians and the Soviets didn't tend to do anything unless thus they thought they were going to get a good return for it, right? So they needed somebody to research it, and they approached Hal Puthoff when they saw the results of the experiment, and essentially contracted with SRI to do this research. That lasted until I want to say roughly mid 1975. And it actually didn't have the being funded or not funded didn't have anything to do with Pat Price. That was like kind of a separate thing. The CIA was just impressed with his abilities, and they hired him directly out of SRI. He actually went to work for the CIA. But what happened was the CIA got caught with his hand in the cookie jar too many times, right? This was when the Church Committee was investigating the intelligence community, and they called the CIA the rogue elephant of the intelligence community. And you know, this is where they were dosing scientists with LSD, and they were taking out hits on foreign leaders, and they were mining harbors that they weren't supposed to be mining, all this kind of stuff. And Congress just came down on them with both feet, and the director was fired, and they brought in a new director, and the new director's marching orders were get rid of anything that's illegal, immoral, or weird. Okay, so remote viewing is legal. It's not immoral, at least in my opinion, and most other people's opinion, but it is weird. And so the CIA just got out of the business. Okay, it really didn't even have to do with the fact that it was remote viewing, other than it was controversial. And so they were left floundering. What do we do now? What do we do now? And that's when Dale Graff in the Air Force stepped in and picked up the funding to keep them alive until DIA and Army and everybody else came on board.
So it wasn't back to funding from the CIA, it became funding from the Air Force and Army intelligence after 1975.
Yeah. Yeah. And the CIA never funded it again after that. It didn't even, it's called the CIA Stargate Program because the authority for it was given to the CIA in 1995 by Congress. And the day the CIA got the authority for it, they canceled the program. So they never funded it ever after 1975.
That's really interesting. So when you were read into this program, uh, what was the mission statement? Like what did they tell you that you would be doing being a part of this program? It would be collecting intelligence data for national security reasons, correct?
Well, yeah, that's paraphrased. It was a little bit more explicit even than that. When they sat me down and read me on the program, it was Tom McNair that did it. He said, our mission is collect intelligence against foreign threats using a parapsychology discipline called remote viewing. Essentially, we want you to volunteer to be a psychic spy, or we're inviting you. I don't remember his exact wording, but something like we're inviting you to volunteer to become a psychic spy. Right? And so, and that pretty much sums up what the mission was. There were some other parts to it too, that like they're supposed to do foreign assessment, which is evaluate what other nations are doing. And let's see, what was the third one? Well, the first one, well, these three were more SRI, but they were related to us too. The first mission was prove that Psi ESP is real. Second of all is learn how to make it more useful, research how to make it more useful. And the third one is to research what other countries are doing in the field as well. And so we were part of that in terms of making it more useful and using it. Plus, some of our folks did foreign assessment as well, but only later on.
What were some of the targets that the team would be tasked to remote view?
The nature of our bread and butter targets kind of morphed over the years. When I first got there, we're worried about terrorism to some degree, but more Soviet R&D, Chinese R&D, particularly weapons developments. Before I got there, they were tasked numerous times on Chinese weapons testing, and also on Pakistani nuclear development. Development of Pakistani nuclear weapons. There's a number of projects in there on that. And of course, then not long after I came on board, then of course. Well, it actually really kind of started before that. Issues in the Middle East, particularly Lebanon, U.S. hostages in Bekaa Valley, those became often frequent targets that we would work. And again, we still had the science and technology, R&D kinds of targets, plus military-related things in the East Bloc in China. Then it kind of morphed, starting about 1990, a little before, maybe as early as 1988. The war on drugs was a big thing, right? And so all the military services were trying to get a chunk of that action, and we got pulled into it because there were obviously things that standard intelligence was never going to be able to tell them. And so they thought, well, it won't hurt to at least try remote viewing, and we did a lot of remote viewing stuff. A significant chunk of which actually worked. We actually had some noteworthy successes working the counter narcotics problem for the joint task forces. And then that was a big one for a while. And then of course, during Desert Storm, I wasn't there, but I got reports from folks. I was actually in Desert Storm. I got transferred out because of my Arabic background and Middle Eastern background. And I got transferred over there to the 101st Airborne, but reports back said they did a lot of Desert Storm stuff, scud hunting and that kind of thing. Not a good deal of evidence that it was successful for reasons we can go into later, maybe. But yeah, so you can see this kind of a spectrum of targets that we worked.
Were you ever personally involved or knew anyone involved in the unit that would possibly be tasked to spy on our government or our military or anything within the United States, or was this all just outside of the United States and foreign assessment?
Yeah, no, any surveillance within the borders of the United States would have been, of course, frowned on by posse comitatus rules. And in fact, that would be the purview of the FBI anyway. The CIA, people think that it's got its finger in every pot, but frankly, it's restricted to overseas, or it can it can have some involvement if it's a foreign threat inside the country, right? But generally speaking, that's FBI territory. And we, as a military service, intelligence service, we are absolutely constrained just for out, overseas. Now, there was one exception, and I'll tell you that in a second. So all of our stuff was foreign threats for the most part. Okay. That one exception was Aldrich Ames. Are you familiar with him? He was a mole, a CIA double turncoat. He was working for the Russians. He revealed the identities to the Russians of a number of important U.S. sources in the Russian Soviet government and military, and they were killed. Obviously, the Russians find out who they are, they're done, right? And Aldrich Ames was doing it for money, and the CIA knew that somebody was spilling these beans. It was impossible for the Russians to find this out without some internal source, and so ultimately they were not having success. We were tasked through Dale Graff down through our folks at Fort Meade, and we developed intelligence that actually was never used, as far as I can tell. But in fact, we provided information that would have caught Aldrich Ames at least a year sooner than he was caught because of the data we provided. Now, he was a U.S. person, which means we would have to have special permission, which they were able to get, apparently. I wasn't in that part of the process, so I'm assuming that they did their due diligence. But that would be a very unusual exception to where we would be targeting our efforts.
So mostly outside of the United States, but in some cases possibly inside of the United States. Where
and that would apply in the counter narcotic stuff too. We did have. I'm. Let me think now. I couldn't quote you chapter and verse, but I do know that we did have exemption to work counter narcotics problems within the United States. So,
have you ever been a part of what would be called a Outbounder exercise? I know that there's a few different names for this. SRI had a name for it, and then the Stargate project had another name for it, where you can remote view and see through somebody else's eyes. Apparently, is this a thing?
Well, that's not exactly how it works. And frankly, our name for it was SRI had two names. They called it a Outbounder or a beacon experiment, and I don't know which one to use the most. I think we used Outbounder mostly, but we would also say beacon. The intent of this is not that you telepathically or in some way use this person as a remote sensor at the target. The way that it works is you have the viewer and usually an interviewer as well, who are blind to the target. It's a double-blind experiment. They are in a sealed room, or at least a shielded room. The outbound team, in the meantime, is randomly assigned a target to go to within 15 minutes to a half an hour drive of the location you're at. And these targets are picked to not be, you can't figure them out just by knowing what the area is. They're intended to be such that you would be surprised if you came across them. You wouldn't be able to logic it out, right? So as the viewer that they're somewhere within a half an hour driving radius. That's all you know. Okay. Then what they do is they go off, and you are asked to remote view to locate them, use them as a beacon to identify the location, and then you remote view the location. Okay. And it works really well. Yeah, my very first ever remote viewing experiment was an Outbounder. I did another one before we went off and started doing what we call now controlled remote viewing. Back then it was called coordinate remote viewing. And since then I've done several, but I probably led a lot more. I've managed these experiments for people. Oftentimes, if some documentary team comes here and wants to see remote viewing done, I'll say, okay, we'll do it. Say, okay, well, when do you want to do it? I said, no, it's not when I want to do it. It's when you're going to do it. They, what? We can't do this stuff. I said, sure you can. And I'll talk them through the process, and we'll have a cameraman and somebody else go out to a randomly selected target that they're blind to and I'm blind to. and we'll sit there and I'll talk them through the process. They'll do it, and it's astonishing. If you've ever seen Suspect Zero, the director came to Austin when I lived in Austin and wanted me to do a demo. And I led him to believe I was going to do one. I never actually said I was going to, but I led him to believe I was going to do it. And when he shows up, he says, okay, well, do you want to do your demonstration before or after? I said, well, it doesn't matter. He said, oh, okay. I said, because I'm not going to do it. He goes, I could see on his head, man, I spent $1,000 to bring a camera crew in there, all of us out here to here, and he's telling me he's not going to do the demo. I said, no, I'm not going to do it. You are. He goes, what? What? And what was really great, is a really great treat. Hal Puthoff is in Austin as well. One of the founders of the remote viewing program. He had left SRI in '85 and come to Austin because he'd been offered his own independent laboratory to do any research he wanted. And so he's there, and I talked him into coming over, and we did the Outbounder. He was the interviewer, and I went out with a cameraman and a young woman who we knew to the target. And so the director's name was Elias Marriage, and he did a great job. We're driving down the road, and you could sort of see the target off in the distance. It was the Pennybacker Bridge in Austin. And he stops talking and looks down the road and he says, that's the target. He gets all excited. He was absolutely thrilled. We get down there and he's going along with his transcript, looking at all the stuff he described and telling us what he'd experienced and stuff. He was so thrilled. And that's in the bonus material on the DVD for Suspect Zero. So if you ever get it, you can watch that. So, and of course, I've done that numerous times for conferences and for workshops and stuff like that. And it's worked really well.
So speaking of leaving the program, when Hal Puthoff left in '85, when did you leave the Stargate project, and how and why did that happen?
August 1990. And I, of course, got into the program September of 1983. So I've been there 7 years, which is an incredibly long time for an Army officer to be anywhere. Usually they move you at the minimum every 3 years. I won't go into why it worked out that way, but it did. And I and my new wife, we got married about 4 months before, and my kids had gone out to the Eastern Shore for vacation. And we come back, and the Monday after I get back, I get a call from Army branch, and they said, I was on orders for Panama for the next, like, December or January. They said, good news is you don't have to go to Panama unaccompanied for 2 years. I said, oh, okay, that's nice. Yeah, the bad news is you're going to Saudi Arabia and Iraq for Desert Storm. And you have 4 days to report to the 101st Airborne at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. And so it was a very abrupt parting from the remote viewing unit. And I go from a totally unusual, out of the ordinary Army environment where you don't wear uniforms. Some of our folks had beards. You don't have to worry about the grooming standards and all that stuff. To a really straight-laced, dress Army combat unit. It was a talk about what do we call it? Cultural. I can't think of the term all of a sudden.
Shock, cultural shock.
Yeah, culture shock. But it was a great experience. I'm glad I did it once. I wouldn't want to repeat it. But yeah, so that's how I got out of the unit. As I just they dragged me over to. They didn't drag me, but they got me over to the Middle East, and I used the limited Arabic skills I still had left.
So how did the other people on the military base view this unit? Did they know that there was a psychic and ESP remote viewing unit on the base at the time, or what was going on there?
They had no idea. There were one or two there who had been read on, so there's a few folks who knew about it, and those folks almost universally were supportive. But the vast majority of people on Fort Meade, even over at NSA, they had no idea that this was going on. NSA, there were a small group of people in NSA who were read on, and an equally small group of number of people who were actually learning it and doing it. NSA had a small program at the time. And we knew some of their folks and, back and forth. But we did not crosswalk. And so, if you were to add up, including everybody in the unit, all the people on Fort Meade that knew about us, might have been 24, might have been 24, 30 at most. All of them with need to know. And Fort Meade had tens of thousands of people on it. So it tells you it was very closely held.
Now, how many people were involved in this project as a remote viewer or a psychic spy? Because from my understanding, it was a very, very small amount of people. And also, could you name any of the people that were there working as a remote viewer or a psychic spy during the period of time that you were there, if you can remember, obviously, because names are very difficult for me to remember a lot of names too. So,
well, I know all these folks pretty well. So some of them really well. So, okay, now the first part of the question was how many? So obviously the number of people went up and down with assignments and stuff, but it was never more than 11. I think 11 was the biggest number we ever had assigned there at one time. There was times when it was only 4 or 5. Before I signed on, 2, 3, there were 5 people there assigned as they were recruiting me. Joe McMonagle, 6, sorry. 2 secretaries, admin folks, the colonel, Skip Atwater, Joe McMonagle, and Tom McNair. So I think that adds up to 6. That was probably the lowest level we got. And then when I and my colleagues came on board, that added 3 more. At the height of the DIA effort, we had about 11. And then it tapered off, and towards the end, there was only 5 people there. I'm sorry, that's the lowest it ever got. It was 5 people in the final waning Stargate days, about 90, 94, 95, somewhere in there.
Did they ever use channelers or anything like that was involved in the project? Were they using any kind of channelers or mystics? Because I've heard stories of like tarot cards and stuff, and I'm just trying to verify if like any of this stuff is true and real.
So yeah, that happened. It happened later in the DIA phase. We had one young woman there. Her name was Angela Della Fioria, and she's now Angela Ford. She's starting to get out in public. She hadn't been public much in the past, and she's starting to get out in public. She came on to be a remote viewer, but she didn't. It wasn't a good fit for her for whatever reason. Part of it doesn't have anything to do with her. It has to do with who they had training her, but I won't go there to avoid controversy. But she already had learned a technique previously, which we called it written remote viewing because we needed to have some kind of acronym that included RV in it. But it was really seemed to me best described as a form of channeling. She had 3 spirit guides, and she may call them something different. I just that's a familiar term to people. She had 3 spirit guides who she would consult as she was kind of automatic writing, and they would provide information about whatever it was she was seeking information about. So it wasn't classic channeling, and that she didn't have one main entity, and she was just acting as a channel. Is like turning over entire volition to this channeler, and then it becomes her in a way. It wasn't that classic form. It was a kind of a hybrid, and she had some success with that. The tarot card thing, I don't think it was ever used as a method to try and remote view. She and another young woman that was recruited later on toyed around with tarot in the back room where their desks were.
Yeah, that's who I was just trying to look up. I think her name was Robin Dahlgren or something like that.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
Robin, I believe.
Yeah, Robin. So they kind of became proteges. There was a bit of an us versus them in the office space because they had this non-standard way of remote viewing, and I think they felt a little bit I guess dismissed. They felt like the rest of us were dismissive of them. Some folks, like Annie Jacobson, has tried to portray it as a male-female thing, but that's not actually the case, because we had females in the outer office that felt the same way about this office divide. They were kind of allied with us, and so it was more methodology, and I have to say we were somewhat unforgiving, because you're not doing it the standard way, and so and frankly, we felt like the command structure was actually biased in their favor. I think there's some evidence for that, but we probably were a little more exaggerated in our feelings about that than was warranted. Whatever the case may be, there was this divisiveness in the office. It didn't stop us from doing our jobs, and we had some pretty good success on both sides of the coin. The WRV actually did produce a couple of really quite spectacular hits, but misses, also spectacular misses. But the same with CRV. We produced some really impressive hits, but then had some failures as well. So without a solid way of evaluating hits and misses and success and all that with remote viewing, which we don't have. Admittedly, we don't have that. It's hard to say if one was better than the other at this point. I felt like the CRV was more successful, but oftentimes it's a personal assessment.
So how did this program become to be declassified? I'm not actually 100% sure when the exact date it became declassified, but not all of it was declassified. It was only portions of the program and a few transcripts of the program, basically to come out and say, yeah, we were doing this, just to give the public some little bit of information. So how did this become to be from your understanding?
Well, I think it was declassified. The program nature of the program and the existence of the program was declassified, but not made public, starting in the fall of 1995. It became widely known on 30 November 1995 in Ted Koppel's Nightline program, where they had Robert Gates, who, Secretary of Defense, Director of the CIA at various times, Dale Graff, Joe McMonagle was on that show, and a number of other folks. They revealed it publicly that the military had been doing remote viewing, had this program, and that's when it really came to the public notice, and it was a huge media storm at that point started up.
So it was basically the public that kind of, and the people from the program that kind of got it declassified in a way.
Well, no, that wouldn't have been on there if they hadn't already had permission from DIA to do it. Well, I guess it'd be CIA at the time. They got clearance. Ed May was on there, who was the successor to Hal Puthoff at SRI. Yeah, I mean, Robert Gates, he wouldn't have been on there at all if he didn't have permission to do it, right? And so he was on there, and the CIA felt the need to make it public, that they had declassified it and canceled the program. They had political reasons to cancel it, political and institutional reasons. And so they didn't want to fool with it anymore. And so we'll let the public know about it, and they'll think it's ridiculous, and then we'll be done with it. Well, they found out that wasn't what happened. So, but at that time, they had classified a lot. They classified all the data that was available prior to 1975, because that's what the CIA itself owned. They had also inherited the archives from the Army and from DIA. That stuff wasn't formally declassified yet, and it took. So in 2004, well, before 2004, I want to say around 2000, 2002, maybe, they turned all of those archives, declassified archives, 100,000 pages worth, over to the National Archives. And you could go and view it at the archives, which of course is very laborious. 2004, the CIA released all of the archives on CD, 14 CD set. You go buy it for like $150 or something, and so that's. But then finally, they realized even that wasn't making it. The public was hugely in demand of this stuff, they finally published it on their own website. PDF had it PDF'd, and they have it archived there now. It's kind of unwieldy if you know what you're looking for. It's relatively easy to find stuff. If you don't know what you're looking for, it's really hard to browse and find juicy stuff. So, but it's there. At least it's publicly available, fully publicly available.
So where did Joe McMonagle come from? Because I've tried to get into some research, and there's some articles online that Joe McMonagle was a part of SRI, and then he kind of got adopted into the Stargate project, but I'm not too sure if that's true or not.
It was the other way around. So Joe was so there's four branches really of intelligence. There's human intelligence, which is the standard spy versus spy kind of a thing. There is measurement signals intelligence, which is, collecting intelligence against non-communication. They're like radars, finding the parameters of radars and range finding systems, all that kind of thing. The main one of the main ones today is SIGINT, which is signals intelligence, which is essentially listening in. I mean, the stereotype is listening into the enemy radio transmissions and telling your commander what the enemy is up to. Right? Joe was a SIGINT guy. He was a signals intelligence guy. And he had some time in Vietnam, had some time elsewhere, he had quite a long career. He was a chief warrant officer at the time he got recruited. The reason he got on board is because he'd had a near-death experience. Now that didn't come up on the radar until they were trying to stand up this program, and they needed to have some people to recruit and train as remote viewers. So Skip Atwater and the commander at the time, Major Scotty Watt, went out and did a survey of the intelligent people in the DC area. And some of the questions were standard intelligence related questions, but some of them were, if you were shown an article in a newspaper about something paranormal, I don't remember what it was, how would you react? Right. And so the people who reacted at least objectively, open-mindedly about it, that became their selection set. And then they had some more things to narrow the selection down. And then they came up with 12 people. And then he asked SRI, here's the background of these 12 folks. You pick the 6 you think are most promising. And so Joe was one of those 6. Mel Riley was another one. Gemma, I can't remember her last name, was another one. She's since passed on. There were 6 there. Ken Bell was one. A lot of these names don't mean anything to anybody because they're not public. But there were 4, and Joe was one of those. That's how he got into the program.
Well, if they're still alive, I would love to interview them. So thank you. That seems to be a really common theme, is near-death experiences with these kinds of abilities, right? It somehow unlocks some part of their consciousness. This is a common thread that I've ran into interviewing a lot of people with psychic abilities and remote viewing abilities. Dr. David Morehouse, near-death experience, Ingo Swann, near-death experience, Joe McMonagle, near-death experience. So it seems to be like a really common thing that is kind of or trauma, some kind of trauma has happened to them that is give them this kind of ability. What's your thoughts on that?
I don't find that to be that common. I think when near-death experience, the proper thing to say is ESP is often a consequence of near-death experience, right? So a lot of near-death experiences do seem to have some kind of psi or ESP experience and develop some faculty there. But most of the remote viewers at Fort Meade that I know, none of them had a near-death experience, right? Joe had one. Who else did you name off? Morehouse. There's somebody else you said. Oh, Ingo. I'd have to look into that. I don't think Ingo had a near-death experience. He did have out-of-body experiences.
Yeah, it was an out-of-body. My bad. I didn't misspoke on that. It was an out-of-body experience. He's commented several times on him being bullied as a child for being gay, and that created this kind of out-of-body experience. But it's very similar to a near-death experience. When you have a near-death experience, your consciousness kind of exits your body, and you have an out-of-body experience.
Or seems to. Yeah, I agree. There are definitely crosswalks between NDEs and OBEs. They're clearly different phenomena, but nonetheless, there are similarities as well. So, but I mean, as I think through the folks that were at Fort Meade before, during, and after me, I only know one or two that had near-death experiences. Yeah. So I would say it's a positive indicator, but it's not necessary. So it's sufficient but not necessary, right? I guess you could say.
I agree with that. I just think that it's really interesting, and you're right a lot, because I think that a lot of the remote viewers from the program was actually, trained to
Mhm.
remote view.
Yeah.
Whenever you look at, like Ingo Swann, I don't believe he was actually trained to do it. It was just an ability that he had and he developed, and then it turned into remote viewing.
Yeah. So just a sidebar here. Everybody's got the ability. Some people develop it trial and error, and that's Ingo. Okay. And some people, of course, have the ability to develop it more easily than others. That would be what we call talent, I think. Ingo had both. Other people are trained, but we all have the ability. It's just we have to cultivate that ability in some way or other in order to really operationalize it.
Yeah, I agree with that. So was there a protocol within this program to get a standard kind of remote viewing within was there like a manual? Because from my understanding, Ingo Swann was training. I know that there was multiple trainers within the program, but from the research and stuff that I've done, Ingo was training a lot of the Army intelligence people and the DIA people. Is that true?
Well, yeah, probably the best way to get into this is, again, give you some context. When the Army program first started, the training consisted of sending the viewers, the potential viewers, we'll start with, out to SRI, and they would work them. They would teach them how to do the Outbounder process. They wouldn't teach them any methodology. It was like throw them in the deep end of the pool, and see if they learn how to swim. That's kind of how they did it, right? And those who were successful in that, like Joe, was really a standout. He was really good. Actually, turned out all six of them were successful, but Joe was probably the one of the most successful. It wasn't the most. There's a couple others who are probably as good as him, right? But he was one of the most successful. And then they came back and they had just kind of learned trial and error how to do it, right? But then Skip developed his own training program, a thing called extended remote viewing, or ERV, that involved hemisync, which was what they practiced. That was the technology they used at the Monroe Institute to synchronize your hemispheres and get you, in a kind of a mind awake, body asleep state. And he added that as a training regimen as well. And then starting in about 1982, SRI came online with the control, well, I'll use their term, coordinate remote viewing, which Ingo and Hal Puthoff, working together, developed laboriously over months and months and months. Came up with that protocol or method. And then that was trained to us by Ingo. Ingo started with Tom McNair. He was the first ever fully trained proof of principle remote viewer in CRV. And then three of us plus Ed Dames. Ed Dames was brought in from a different unit. He was temporarily assigned so that he could learn this. The other unit had the idea of using him. So there were five of us being trained by Ingo. And that's everything came from there. Okay, so SRI lost the contract at the end of 1984 to train people because the Army, well, that's a whole complicated story too. I can tell it later if you want. The Army decided to get out of the remote viewing business. And so the SRI contract was canceled, and we were left on our own to train additional coordinate remote viewers, or control remote viewers, as we say today. I was asked, because they thought I had the best grasp on the methodology. I was asked to kind of honcho the creation of a manual that captured everything that Ingo had taught us about controlled remote viewing or remote viewing. And
Really quick, I don't mean to interrupt, but
Yeah, no,
what?
no, I'm going on a link. So
No,
go
no,
ahead.
no, no, no. It's really interesting. And remember where you picked off. I just want to clarify something really quick that you mentioned. You mentioned that they lost their funding
Yeah.
in there. So what point did SRI stop working with or commingling with the Army intelligence and DIA?
So didn't exactly, because DIA is a higher headquarters than our headquarters. The DIA wasn't under any obligation to the Army on this. So DIA continued their part of the program. So SRI was always fully engaged uh, via DIA. It was just the Army that dropped out. Okay. But DIA was a little annoyed that the Army had canceled this. And so they offered to pick it up. And the Army said, okay, fine. It's out of our hands. We don't have to worry about it anymore. So here, take it. And of course, there's always a transition period institutionally, bureaucratically. And so it took about a year to do the full translation. Well, I guess that counts. Transition from the Army to DIA. And DIA, we went live at DIA on January 31st of 1986. And so at that point, everything is under DIA's roof instead of DIA being part of it and the Army being part of it or the Air Force. And that's where it went for another almost 10 years.
When did Ego Swann step away? When did he stop training Army intelligence or DIA?
December 1984. That was our group. We were the last folks to train with him in the military. Oh, that was part of your question. From that point on, we became the trainers. So, for example, Lynn Buchanan, I don't know if you've talked to him yet.
Yes.
Yeah, Lynn Buchanan came on in, I want to say April, May, somewhere in that time frame. I have it down somewhere. I'm just going by memory here, of 1984. And once we were done with our training, at least the first three stages, then starting in late 1984 and into 85, we became his trainers. So I taught him the theory, the process, the practice, the method. And then all of us took turns working with him as training monitors, giving him targets, monitoring him as he does his sessions and like that. And so he got trained by us. And then not long after that, Mel Riley came in and we went through the same process with him. And then much, much later, Dave Morehouse came in and he got trained. And then left. Actually, he was there. He was the shortest guy assigned to the unit. I don't mean height wise, that was Ed Dames, but but Dave was there for 2 years, period, and then gone. But we trained him, and there were several other people who aren't publicly known that we trained. Lynn ultimately helped with the training, once he mastered the skill, and everybody kind of pitched in to help once they developed the ability to do it.
So was there anybody that was still in the unit that was trained by Ego Swann that was helping train others that were just getting into the unit?
I was the last one. When I went to Desert Storm, I was the last Ingo trained viewer there. And after that, it was, I don't know, they trained anybody after I left. I think they just, with the folks who were on board, and they gradually transferred out. At the end, there was only 3 remote viewers. Angela, who was using WRV, Robin, who was, I'm not sure what methodology she was using, and then another guy, Greg Seward, who I had actually helped train, who was doing CRV. That was what was left when the CIA took the program over and canceled it.
Interesting. Is Greg still alive?
He, unless I knew a couple months back, he was, yeah.
Interesting. So do we have any proof or thoughts or ideas or even speculation, right? Because there's a lot of speculation that involves a lot of these programs and stuff, and that's why I'm trying to clear it up by going in and interviewing everyone, trying to put all the pieces together. Do we have any proof or anything that maybe there was another program that was started up, another SAP program after the CIA closed the program in 95? I know that there, it's just basically theory and speculation, but what do you think actually happened after the CIA closed the
I
project?
think they canceled the program and meant it to be for good. Okay. You have to consider that the director of the CIA, when the program was offered to them, actually it wasn't offered, they were ordered to take it by Congress. The director was, I want to say, John Deutsch, I think was his first name. I keep thinking I have to look that up, and I keep forgetting. Last name was definitely Deutsch. And Deutsch was, as I recall, formerly a nuclear physicist. He was absolutely opposed to remote viewing. He was famous for kicking people out of his office if they came in to try and brief him on the state of the program. And so I can imagine, I don't have evidence, I can imagine when somebody told him, yeah, the CIA is going to acquire the remote viewing program, I can imagine him saying, not only no, but hell no. Right. And so, yeah, the CIA definitely terminated the program with extreme prejudice because they did not want to do it. Now, the interesting thing, it was still on the books, because along with the program came 12 personnel slots. And that was during, of course, the Bill Clinton drawdown of the intelligence community. And everybody was desperate for personnel slots because they were losing them right and left. So the CIA kept the program nominally, but then they used those slots, they dispersed them all over the agency to be filled by other kinds of disciplines and stuff. So it was quite cynical the way they did it.
So you don't think the government or the military or any of these three-letter organizations would be using psychics or remote viewers for anything after 1995?
No, I'm pretty confident that they were not. You have to understand the nature of the institutions. They're very conservative. They're very reluctant to do things that might get them in trouble career-wise. If the press found out that there were some official was promoting research and using paranormal stuff, it would be very bad for them image-wise, right? And I think that budget-wise, if it's a cheap thing, but budget-wise, they don't spend. I better not say that. That's probably not true. I'm going to say that they don't spend, money they don't have to spend. That's in many cases not true. But I think there are a number of reasons why they wouldn't do it. Now, it's also possible, if they ever did decide they wanted to do it, they could easily reach outside the agency with intelligence contingency funding and hire contractors to do it and not have their own program. Right. In fact, they have done that on a number of occasions, particularly during the height of the global war on terror. Mid-level folks did reach out and either pro bono get remote viewers to do things or had some money that they could hire them to do. My little organization actually was asked by an Army Major Command to try and find a missing soldier in Iraq. Now, this wasn't something they budgeted for. This was a favor. But yeah, contacted by a 2-star, I guess, in the Major Command and asked to do this. And we worked a bit with some folks in the Pentagon and so on. And so those kind of things did happen, but they indicate, to me, that's further indication that the agencies don't have their own in-house program. This was kind of confirmed for me, is back a while back. Hal Puthoff and I were jointly approached by a third-tier official, I think a deputy assistant director or something from the CIA, asking what would it take to set up a program again at CIA. Now, if they're looking to ask that question, it means they don't have one. Right? Now, it didn't go anywhere because we got a report back from this person that they had floated it with the director of the CIA, and it was that not only no, but hell no response that they got. We're not going to have anything to do with that stuff, and they were quite disappointed because they their next level supervisor had actually endorsed the idea, but the boss had said, no, we're not going to do it. So it didn't go any further than that. Now, the one exception is NSA. Now, when I say no, I don't think anybody, certainly the military services are not doing it. Absolutely no way are they doing it. Could DIA be doing it? Well, I mean, it's logically possible, but lots of things are logically possible that aren't practically possible, right? So I really doubt DIA is doing it. I really doubt the CIA is doing it. But NSA did have a program. And every now and again, I hear some little tantalizing tidbit that suggests that they might still have a program. And if that's the case, well, then maybe they're doing it. I hope they're doing it. You know, I hope, because it's a capability that is a very useful adjunct to all the other kinds of intelligence collection that we do. And I think it's irresponsible not to. But I don't know that for sure, you know.
Yeah, my personal thoughts on this is I've never been involved with the military or been involved with any three-letter organizations, but based off of, history and researching it, they don't ever shut something down just to completely shut it down.
Yes.
They
They
they find a different reason for it. They find a different purpose for the thing that they were trying to do, and then they create something else. Right?
Well, there are some things that they do that with. I don't deny that. There are some things they do that with. There are plenty of things they shut down and never revive. Okay. So I guess I'm arguing with the statement you said, they never shut something down. That's not true. There are things they absolutely terminate and never bring back. Now, there are some things that they, shall we say, repurpose, right? There are some things that get repurposed. In this case, I don't think remote viewing is one of them. And it's just because.
But if they found a different application for the remote viewing that did not involve collecting intelligence data from foreign assessments or even collecting intelligence data within the United States, they would transfer that into a different project. I mean, that's just theory and speculation. I have absolutely no proof. This is my personal thoughts and my personal opinion.
Well, here's what I'm saying. I can't think of an application for remote viewing that doesn't fall in those categories. I don't know what you'd use it for if you didn't use it for that within the government.
Remote control, remote influence, remote assassination.
That's not remote viewing. Remote viewing,
but it's a different application of remote viewing.
No, it's not. And I'm sorry, I'm push back on this because I get this so much out there in the remote viewing community. Remote influencing is a totally different animal than remote viewing. And here's the reason. The only thing that's common is it involves mental functioning, right? Remote viewing is a passive information collecting, distance experiential kind of a thing. Remote influencing is a projective, active, interactive kind of a process.
Right, I agree.
180 degrees out, right? So, and would they use remote influencing? Well, they might try it. Frankly, I'm quite skeptical that it even actually works. People say, what do you mean? Obviously, if remote viewing works, remote influencing doesn't. I say, no, not necessarily. Show me evidence that it works. And nobody, so Lynn Buchanan's big on remote influencing, and Dave Morehouse got into remote influencing, at least talking about it, because of conversations he had with Lynn Buchanan. Lynn Buchanan was one that told Dave about this, right? So both of them talked remote influencing. I have challenged Lynn numerous occasions. If remote influencing works, show me the evidence. And he's never been able to. Never been able to. So until I see evidence that it works, I'm very dubious. Now, in general, like psychokinesis, like they practiced at the Pear Lab, that they researched at the Pear Lab, prayer studies that show prayer is efficacious. Those things do seem to work, and they are a sort of a kind of remote influencing, right? But the kind of remote influencing people talk about when they say remote influencing is where you project some thought, and I'm making this very simplistic. You project some thought to someone else and cause them to do or not do something that they otherwise either would have done or would have chosen not to do. So essentially, you're overcoming some of their agency. I've never seen any evidence of it, and I suspect that we have protections built in. If that's a possible thing, evolution would have made it so that we had resistance to that. Because if you could be influenced by somebody else, to do something that might not be in your best interest, you get edited out of the gene pool pretty quickly. Right. And so those who had a built-in resistance would be evolutionary. It would be an evolutionary benefit to have resistance from remote influencing. You think about the times you're driving down the road, somebody cuts you off, the thoughts you're thinking at that person, if remote influencing was real, their heads would explode in a circumstance like that. So I'm very dubious about it.
Well, it can be more subtle than that, I believe, right? Because there are we can influence ourselves, right? That's what affirmations are for. That's why you would
which is
say
not
things
remote. Obviously, that's
wouldn't
not
be remote, but I tend to think that it would work the same way if you're putting out a thought and an idea and sending it to someone else. I mean, there's technologies that are patents for these kinds of technology that's been built. V2K is a very real technology that there's patents for that can send thoughts, ideas, messages into people's minds via technology. And
those things are way overhyped. There's some real issues with that, which we don't need to get into now. We've been on for a while. I'm gonna have to jump off pretty quick. So we can have another get together. Go through the process again of trying to get together on our schedules. But yeah.
I mean, that's just my my personal thoughts and going through researching it and getting into it. I mean, there's literal patents for changing the central nervous system within human beings on the planet, right? So if there's a technology for it, then how did they develop that technology? They would have to develop it from some kind of real ability from someone.
Not necessarily. We know a lot about how the central nervous system works. We know a lot about how non-ionizing radiation works, in other words, electromagnetic spectrum. We know a lot about human perception. We know a fair amount about human ideation and cognition. And so just the mere fact putting two and two together based on what we know just from a physicalist perspective, we could have developed this technology. We don't have to have some pre-existing naturalistic facility from a mental perspective. I mean, remote viewing, any of these kind of non-local perceptual abilities and such are not electromagnetic in nature. They're probably not even physical in nature. And so all of the kind of stuff you're talking about, the intervention technology, is all electromagnetic, all physical in nature. So it's a completely orthogonally different underlying ontology, right? It's just completely different than when we talk about remote influencing in terms of mental abilities, mental facilities. So, yeah, I get kind of wrapped around the axle because so many people take what the technology is and really extrapolate way beyond what it really has the capability of doing. For example, in terms of people say, well, we have mind reading machines now. No, we don't. We have machines that can learn how to interpret certain brainwave configurations in certain individuals and judge what word they're thinking of or what image they're thinking of, whatever.
Oh, absolutely. Our phones do that all the time. You'd be talking about something and then you get an ad for it on Facebook or on YouTube or something. It's incredible. And I don't think that that's a mind reading thing. I think that that's just
behavioral observation and whatever. Yeah. But there are technologies that can you put the little thing on, right, and the EEG or fMRI or whatever it is they use is able to recognize patterns in your brain that correspond to words that you might be thinking, right? But people think that's a mind reading machine, but it's not, because it has to be trained to respond to your particular behavioral, thought patterns, right? Your brain configurations. And everybody's brain configuration is different from everybody else. It's a thing called multiple realizability, which means that each brain does things differently. There are general patterns that are similar, but each brain does things differently than every other brain on the planet. And so if you wanted to have really universal mind reading capability, everybody would have to stick their head in this machine for hours and allow the machine to code how they did this kind of a thing in order for this to work. And obviously that's not going to happen. So
Exactly. I agree. So I have one more question. I'm going to let you go. I know you have things
Oh yeah, I
to
haven't
do.
bored you for the last 10 minutes. I get
No,
on soapboxes and
no, I love it. I love these kinds of discussions. I think that they're great and they're very expanding for the audience. And I appreciate your time, of course. So I was listening to this. This is a completely kind of different topic, but it still involves remote viewing. I was listening to this video by Jim Mars, right? And he was talking about Skip Atwater having these notes from Pat Price saying that he remote viewed 4 alien bases on the planet. One was in Australia, Antarctica, and Africa, and another one in between the mountains of Spain and France. And supposedly, according to Jim Mars, Skip Atwater had the team, the unit at the Stargate project remote view this as well. Now, he didn't say who or what, or, it was only that he just mentioned this in one of his speaking engagements. Do you know anything
yeah, I
about
actually
this?
have copies of those same documents. Hal put off with is has the originals and he gave me copies of them. So yeah, and that actually is a long topic. So I maybe you want to leave that as a cliffhanger, and then I'll revisit it later because I'm not sure I want to get into that now. It's probably another half hour worth of conversation. So, but yes,
But
the answer,
confirmed.
yeah, it's real. Yeah. Now, whether what Pat came up with is real, well, there's some provocative data that was produced when Skip had us remote view these things.
So confirmed real. This did happen. Pat Price did remote view these alien bases, and it was given to some of the people in the unit, and they also remote viewed it.
Yes, correct.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Paul. Appreciate your time this evening. Let people know where they can find you online.
Well, you can go to my website, rviewer.com, the letter R and the word viewer. So RVIEWER.com. And pretty much you can find anything from there.
Awesome. Thanks so much. The links to all of Paul's information will be in the description of this video. For everyone else, thanks for watching and listening. Much love to everyone in the chat. Please be sure to hit the thumbs up button to help the channel in the YouTube algorithm. Share, subscribe, hit the bell icon as well. And remember, we're not only in a spiritual war, but a war on humanity. Stay aware, stay alert, keep loving your heart for everyone. Stay safe out there. And if you can see through the illusion, you are the solution. See you guys next time.